In the summer of 2010, in a quiet nursing home in Munich, an 87-year-old man named Heinrich Müller sat across from a journalist, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he held a faded photograph. The image showed him as a young Wehrmacht soldier, barely 20, standing proudly in his uniform beside the Brandenburg Gate. But it wasn't this photo that had brought tears to his eyes. It was a story he was about to tell, a story that would challenge everything we think we know about war, captivity, and the resilience of the human spirit. You want to know about the war? Heinrich asked, his voice carrying the weight of decades. Everyone thinks they know about the war. They know about the battles, the victories, the defeats. But do you know about the paradox? Do you know that some of us German soldiers who fought for fatherland discovered our humanity only after we became prisoners of our enemies? This is the story Heinrich and dozens of other German veterans finally agreed to tell 65 years after the war's end. It's a story about how the collapse of everything they believed in led to the most profound discovery of their lives, that sometimes the enemy's cage can be more liberating than your own nation's embrace. The spring of 1945 arrived in Berlin like a funeral shroud. Heinrich Müller, then a 22-year-old Oberstfreiter in the Wehrmacht, crouched in the rubble of what had once been the Potsdamer Platz, listening to the thunder of Soviet artillery drawing ever closer. The city that had once pulsed with the rhythm of Nazi rallies and the dreams of the Thousand-Year Reich now lay broken, its grand boulevards transformed into graveyards of concrete and steel. We had been taught that we were the master race, Heinrich recalled, his eyes distant with memory. We believed that German soil was sacred, that our cause was righteous, that victory was our destiny. But as I watched Berlin burn around us, I realized that destiny had other plans. For young soldiers like Heinrich, the collapse of Nazi Germany wasn't just a military defeat. It was a complete dissolution of their reality. They had grown up in a world where the Führer's word was gospel, where German superiority was an unquestionable fact, where their enemies were painted as subhuman monsters who would show no mercy to captured German soldiers. The propaganda machine had worked tirelessly to cement these beliefs. In schools, children learned that Slavs were unmentioned, subhumans, while Anglo-Americans were portrayed as culturally bankrupt warmongers controlled by Jewish puppet masters. Soviet soldiers, they were told, were savage barbarians who would torture and execute any German they captured. Surrender, according to Nazi doctrine, was not just cowardice. It was treason against the race itself. Klaus Weber, another veteran who shared his story, remembered the final days in Berlin with crystalline clarity. We were boys pretending to be men, holding positions that couldn't be held, fighting for a cause that was already lost. But we fought because we didn't know what else to do. Our entire world was crumbling, and surrender felt like stepping into an abyss. The physical destruction was overwhelming, but the psychological destruction cut deeper. These young men had built their identities around the Nazi ideology of racial superiority and national destiny. They had volunteered not just to serve their country, but to participate in what they believed was humanity's greatest experiment in racial purity and cultural advancement. When that dream began to collapse, it took their sense of self with it. I remember the moment I knew it was over, Heinrich said. I was helping to evacuate civilians from a bombed-out apartment building when I found a family, grandmother, mother, and 2 small children, huddled in their basement. The grandmother looked at me, this young soldier in his torn uniform, and asked, "What did we do this for?" I had no answer. For the first time in my life, I had no answer. The final weeks of the war in Berlin were a descent into hell. Food was scarce, ammunition was running low, and hope had become a luxury none could afford. The city's defenders were a mixture of seasoned veterans, teenage boys from a Hitler Youth, and old men from a Volkssturm. They fought not because they believed in victory, but because they were terrified of what would happen if they stopped fighting. Soviet forces advanced block by block, and with each passing day, the reality of defeat became more undeniable. The grand narratives of Nazi propaganda, the invincible Wehrmacht, the superior German race, the inevitable triumph of National Socialism, crumbled like the buildings around them. But perhaps most devastating was the growing realization that they had been lied to about everything. As refugees fled westward with stories of Soviet brutality, Many German soldiers began to understand that their own forces had committed similar atrocities in the East. The moral certainty that had sustained them through years of war began to crack under the weight of truth. We started to hear whispers. Klaus remembered stories from soldiers who had served on the Eastern Front, stories about what we had done to Soviet prisoners, to civilians, to entire communities. For boys who had been raised to believe we were the defenders of civilization, these revelations were shattering. The end came swiftly. On May 2nd, 1945, the Battle of Berlin concluded with the city's surrender. Heinrich found himself among thousands of German soldiers marching into captivity, their weapons abandoned, their cause lost, their future uncertain. As they walked through the rubble-strewn streets under the watchful eyes of Soviet guards, many wondered if they would ever see their homeland again. "I thought I was walking to my death," Heinrich admitted. Everything we'd been told suggested that capture by the Soviets meant execution, or at best, a slow death in some Siberian labor camp. I said goodbye to my life that day, made peace with God, and prepared for whatever fate awaited me. But fate, as Heinrich and thousands of other German POWs would discover, had prepared something far more complex and transformative than they could have imagined. Are you ready to discover how these young German soldiers, raised on Nazi ideology and convinced of their own superiority, found their greatest teachers among their captors? The next chapter reveals the shocking reality that awaited them behind enemy lines. The transport train that carried Heinrich and 300 other German prisoners eastward was a cattle car that reeked of fear and uncertainty. For 3 days, they traveled to the devastated landscape of Eastern Europe, watching through small bar windows as the evidence of war's destruction rolled past, burned villages, abandoned farmlands, and the occasional grave marker standing sentinel over the chaos. "We were convinced we were being taken to our execution," recalled Werner Hoffmann, a former Panzer commander who had been captured near Königsberg. The propaganda had told us that Bolsheviks were savages who showed no mercy to German prisoners. We spent those 3 days on the train writing farewell letters to our families, letters we were sure would never be delivered. When the train finally stopped at a prisoner of war camp in what is now western Poland, the German soldiers expected to march toward their deaths. Instead, they encountered something that challenged their most fundamental assumptions about their enemies: basic human decency. The camp itself defied their expectations. While hardly luxurious, it was organized, clean, and efficiently run. Barracks were weatherproof. Latrines were sanitary, and there was even a small infirmary staffed by captured German medical personnel under Soviet supervision. The fences were high and the guards were armed, but there were no torture chambers, no execution grounds, no evidence of the barbarism they had been led to expect. The first shock came during processing. Heinrich remembered, "We were expecting beatings, humiliation, maybe worse. Instead, we were given medical examinations, deloused, provided with clean clothing, and assigned to barracks." A Soviet officer who spoke perfect German explained the camp rules and told us that as long as we followed regulations, we would be treated according to international law. The Soviet officer was Captain Dmitry Volkov, a former literature professor from Leningrad who had lost his entire family during the brutal German siege of his city. By all rights, he should have been filled with hatred for his German prisoners. Instead, he became their unlikely protector and, eventually, their teacher. "I cannot tell you how confused we were," Klaus admitted. Here was a man whose people we had tried to destroy, whose city we had starved for 872 days, whose family had died because of our actions. We expected him to take revenge. Instead, he treated us with a dignity we had never shown to Soviet prisoners. The daily routine of camp life began to reveal the extraordinary character of their captors. Soviet guards shared their rations when German prisoners fell ill. Russian medics worked around the clock to save German soldiers suffering from typhus and dysentery. Most surprisingly, camp administrators made genuine efforts to maintain communication between prisoners and their families back home, when such communication was possible. "I remember the day a package arrived for me," Werner recalled, his voice thick with emotion. "It was from my mother in Bavaria. Inside were photographs of my younger sister, some homemade cookies, and a letter telling me she was praying for my safe return. The Soviet mail clerk who delivered it had tears in his eyes. He told me, through a translator that he had a mother too. But the real transformation began during the educational programs that Captain Volkov organized. Unlike the brutal re-education camps of later decades, these early sessions were more like university seminars. Volkov, drawing on his background as an educator, created discussion groups where German prisoners could grapple with the reality of what their nation had done and what had been done to them. He never lectured us, Heinrich explained. Instead, he asked us questions. Simple questions that cut to the heart of everything we thought we knew. What did you think would happen to German prisoners in Soviet hands? He would ask. And now that you're here, what do you see? The contrast between our expectations and our reality was so stark that it forced us to question everything else we had been taught. The camp library, stocked with books that had been banned in Nazi Germany, became a sanctuary for many prisoners. Here, they could read insensate accounts of history, philosophy, and literature that revealed the complexity of the world beyond Nazi propaganda. Heinrich discovered the works of Heinrich Heine, the German Jewish poet whose books had been burned by the Nazis. Klaus found himself captivated by Tolstoy's War and Peace, with its nuanced portrayal of conflict and human nature. Reading those books was like emerging from a dark cave, Klaus reflected. For the first time, I began to understand that the world was not divided into superior and inferior races, but into human beings with different experiences, cultures, and perspectives. The camp's medical facilities provided another revelation. Dr. Sarah Rosenberg, a Jewish physician from Kiev who had survived the massacre at Babi Yar, worked alongside German doctors to treat both Soviet and German patients. Her presence in the camp should have been impossible, according to Nazi ideology. Jews, they had been taught, were subhuman parasites incapable of real medical knowledge or genuine compassion. Dr. Rosenberg saved my life. Werner admitted quietly, I had developed pneumonia during the winter of 1946, and the German doctors had given up on me. She worked day and night, using techniques and medicines I had never seen before. When I asked her why she was helping a German soldier, she simply said, because you're sick and I'm a doctor. It was the most profound moral lesson I ever received. The camp's food distribution system also challenged their preconceptions. Despite the severe shortages throughout the Soviet Union, a result in part of the destruction German forces had caused, prisoners received regular meals that, while modest, provided adequate nutrition. Soviet guards often went hungry, so that prisoners could maintain their strength. We learned that the guards' families were starving in Leningrad, in Stalingrad, in Kiev. Heinrich said, cities that our armies had devastated. Yet these men shared their bread with us. They could have let us starve. God knows we had given them reason enough, but they chose to act with humanity instead of vengeance. Perhaps most remarkably, the camp became a place where former enemies began to form genuine friendships. Soviet guards taught German prisoners Russian folk songs. German prisoners shared stories of their hometowns and families. During the long winter evenings, they played chess, discussed literature, and found common ground in their shared humanity. There was a guard named Alexei who had lost his brothers at Stalingrad. Klaus recalled, he and I became friends over a game of chess. One evening, as we played by candlelight, he told me that he had learned to separate the German people from the Nazi regime. You are not my enemy, he said. The ideology that sent you to kill my brothers, that is my enemy. The seeds of profound transformation were being planted, but the German prisoners had no idea how deeply their worldview was about to change. What happens when soldiers raised on hate discover that their greatest teachers are those they once considered subhuman? Chapter 3 reveals the extraordinary relationships that would challenge everything they thought they knew about friend and foe. Winter in the POW camp arrived early in 1945, bringing with it temperatures that plunged well below freezing, and a test of human character that would forever change the lives of the German prisoners. It was during this brutal season that Heinrich Müller witnessed an act of compassion so profound that it shattered the last remnants of his Nazi indoctrination. The incident began when a young German prisoner named Fritz, barely 18 years old, collapsed during morning roll call. He had been suffering from a persistent cough for weeks, but the camp's medical supplies were stretched thin, and his condition had worsened dramatically overnight. As Fritz lay unconscious in the snow, Heinrich expected the Soviet guards to leave him there. After all, Wasn't this how German forces had treated 6 Soviet prisoners? Instead, Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Petrov, a battle-scarred veteran who had fought at Kursk and whose unit had liberated several German concentration camps, immediately called for medical assistance. But more than that, he removed his own winter coat and wrapped it around the unconscious German soldier, then personally carried Fritz to the infirmary. I watched a man whose comrades we had killed, whose country we had invaded, whose people we had tried to exterminate, risk his own health to save the life of his enemy, Heinrich recalled, his voice barely above a whisper. At that moment, I realized I had never truly understood what it meant to be human. Lieutenant Petrov's actions were not isolated. Throughout the camp, Soviet personnel consistently demonstrated a level of humanity that stood in stark contrast to everything the German prisoners had been taught about their captors. When dysentery swept through the barracks in late 1945, Russian medics worked 18-hour shifts to prevent deaths. When winter clothing ran short, Soviet guards shared their own garments with German prisoners. When food supplies dwindled, it was the captors who went hungry first. Captain Volkov had instituted what he called conversation circles, informal gatherings where prisoners could ask questions about their captors' experiences and share their own stories. These sessions became laboratories of human understanding, places where the artificial barriers of race, nationality, and ideology began to crumble. I remember the evening when Guard Sergeant Yuri Kozlov told us about his village, said Werner, his eyes distant with memory. It was a small farming community near Smolensk that had been completely destroyed during the German advance in 1941. His parents, his wife, his 2 young daughters, all killed. He had every reason to hate us, to treat us brutally. Instead, he showed us photographs of his family and spoke about them with love, not hatred. The conversation that followed was unlike anything these German soldiers had ever experienced. Kozlov asked them about their own families, their own villages, their own dreams before the war. As the prisoners shared their stories, a remarkable thing happened. The Russians began to see them not as representatives of an evil regime, but as young men who had been caught up in forces beyond their control. Kozlov listened to our stories with genuine interest. Werner continued. When Klaus told him about his father's bakery in Munich, Kozlov's eyes lit up. His own father had been a baker, too. They spent the rest of the evening comparing recipes and techniques. 2 men from different worlds finding common ground in flour and yeast. Dr. Rosenberg became particularly influential in breaking down the prisoners' racial prejudices. During her medical examinations, she would often engage prisoners in conversation about their lives, their fears, and their families. Her gentle questioning helped many of them confront the contradictions between what they had been taught about Jewish people and the reality of her character and competence. She had every reason to let German prisoners suffer, Heinrich admitted. Her entire family had been murdered at Babi Yar, shot and thrown into a mass grave by German soldiers. Yet she treated us with the same care and attention she gave to Soviet patients. When I asked her how she could do this, she said something I will never forget. Hatred is a poison that destroys the vessel that contains it. I choose healing instead. The camp's cultural exchange programs further eroded the barriers between captors and prisoners. Soviet guards taught German folk dances they had learned from ethnic Germans who had lived in Russia for generations. German prisoners shared their knowledge of classical music, organizing impromptu concerts using instruments cobbled together from camp materials. On Christmas Eve 1945, prisoners and guards came together for a celebration that transcended national boundaries. Picture this, Klaus said, leaning forward in his chair. German soldiers singing Silent Night in their native tongue, while Russian guards hummed along with a melody they had learned as children from German settlers in the Volga region. In that moment, we weren't enemies or captors or prisoners. We were just human beings sharing a moment of peace. The education programs that Captain Volkov organized became increasingly sophisticated. Rather than crude propaganda sessions, they resembled graduate seminars in philosophy, history, and ethics. German prisoners were encouraged to read primary sources about the war, including documented accounts of German atrocities that had been hidden from them by Nazi censorship. Learning about the Holocaust was devastating, Werner admitted. We had heard rumors, of course, but seeing the photographs, reading the testimonies, understanding the scale of what had been done in our name. It destroyed any remaining loyalty to the Nazi regime. But what struck me most was how our Soviet captors presented this information. There was no gloating, no "we told you so," just sorrow that such things had been possible. The prisoners began to understand that their captors had shown them mercy not because they were weak, but because they were strong. The Soviet system, despite its own significant flaws, had managed to maintain fundamental principles of human dignity even in the face of unprecedented brutality from German forces. I began to realize that the men holding us prisoner were better soldiers than we had ever been, Heinrich reflected. Not because they were better at killing, but because they were better at remaining human in the face of inhumanity. They had defeated us not just militarily, but morally. The transformation wasn't universal or immediate. Some German prisoners remained bitter and resentful, clinging to Nazi ideology even in the face of overwhelming evidence of its bankruptcy. But for men like Heinrich, Klaus, and Werner, the experience of being treated humanely by those they had been taught to dehumanize created a cognitive dissonance that forced them to reevaluate everything they believed. The letters these prisoners began writing home reflected their changing worldview. Where once they had written of their captors as subhuman monsters, they now described them as surprisingly decent, unexpectedly kind, and more civilized than we were led to believe. These letters, when they reached Germany, caused considerable consternation among Nazi sympathizers who had expected tales of Soviet barbarism to confirm their racist beliefs. "My mother saved all my letters in the camp," Heinrich said, producing a worn bundle of papers. "Reading them now, I can trace my transformation from a convinced Nazi to someone who was beginning to understand what it really meant to be German. Not the master race, but simply one people among many, capable of both great evil and great good." The psychological impact of this treatment extended beyond individual transformation. The German prisoners began to develop a sense of collective shame about their nation's actions, but also a growing hope that redemption might be possible. If their enemies could show them mercy, perhaps Germany itself could find a path back to respectability among the nations of the world. But the most profound revelations were yet to come. As the daily routines of camp life settled into a rhythm, these German prisoners would discover that their captors weren't just treating them humanely. They were showing them a way of life that was, in many ways, superior to what they had known even before the war. How could this be possible? Chapter 4 explores the daily bread that nourished not just their bodies, but their souls. The morning routine at Camp 12 began at 6 a.m. with the sound of a brass bell, not the harsh blare of a military bugle. This small detail, Heinrich would later realize, was symbolic of everything that made their captivity so unexpectedly civilized. Even in prison, their Soviet captors sought to maintain a sense of dignity and order rather than harsh militaristic discipline. The bell was rung by Sergeant Petrov himself, Heinrich recalled. He would walk through the barracks, gently waking those who hadn't stirred, helping the sick to their feet, making sure everyone was ready for the day. Compare this to our own boot camps, where sergeants would kick sleeping recruits and scream obscenities. Here was an enemy soldier treating his prisoners with more respect than our own officers had shown us. The daily schedule that emerged in the camp was a masterpiece of organization that served multiple purposes: maintaining order, providing meaningful work, and creating opportunities for education and personal growth. After morning roll call and a breakfast of black bread, porridge, and ersatz coffee, prisoners were assigned to work details that varied based on their skills and the camp's needs. Klaus found himself assigned to the camp's carpentry workshop, where he worked alongside Soviet civilians who had been hired to help maintain the facility. "These Russian carpenters became my teachers," Klaus remembered. "They showed me techniques I had never learned in Germany, ways of working with wood that were both more efficient and more beautiful. But more than that, they shared their lunch with me, asked about my family, and treated me like a colleague rather than an enemy." The workshop became a microcosm of cooperation that transcended national boundaries. German precision met Russian creativity, producing furniture and repairs that were both functional and aesthetically pleasing. The pride that prisoners took in their work was genuine. They were contributing something positive to the community that housed them, even if that community was technically their prison. Werner, with his mechanical background from the Panzer Corps, was assigned to the camp's motor pool. Here he worked on maintaining the vehicles that kept the camp supplied with food, medicine, and other necessities. The Soviet mechanics taught me about engines I had never encountered, Werner explained. But they also taught me about responsibility. Every vehicle we repaired could mean the difference between life and death for someone in the camp, prisoner or guard alike. They made me understand that good work was a moral obligation, not just a professional requirement. The midday meal was perhaps the most revealing aspect of camp life. Despite the severe food shortages throughout the Soviet Union, shortages caused largely by German destruction of agricultural areas, the camp administration made extraordinary efforts to ensure that prisoners received adequate nutrition. The bread was dark and heavy. The soup was thin, but the portions were fair and the distribution was equitable. I learned that the guards' families in nearby villages were often hungrier than we were. Heinrich said quietly, Lieutenant Petrov once showed me a letter from his mother, describing how they were surviving on potato peels and tree bark. Yet he never reduced our rations. He told me, my mother would be ashamed if I starved prisoners in her name. The afternoon work details continued the morning's pattern of purposeful activity. Some prisoners worked in the camp's vegetable garden, learning agricultural techniques that they would later use when they returned to Germany. Others were assigned to the library, where they helped catalog books and assisted with the educational programs. The camp even had a small orchestra, made up of prisoners and guards who came together in the evenings to perform classical music. Music became our universal language, Klaus reflected. When German prisoners played Bach and Beethoven alongside Russian guards playing Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff, we discovered that beauty belonged to no single nation. Art was humanity's common heritage, not the exclusive property of any master race. The evening educational programs, led by Captain Volkov, had evolved from simple discussions into sophisticated seminars on history, philosophy, and ethics. But these weren't propaganda sessions designed to break the prisoners' spirits. Instead, they were genuine attempts to help young men understand the world beyond the narrow confines of Nazi ideology. Volkov would present us with moral dilemmas, Werner remembered. He would describe a situation, perhaps a soldier who had to choose between following orders and protecting civilians, and ask us what we would do. These discussions forced us to think about right and wrong in ways that went far beyond following the Führer's will. The turning point came on a cold February morning in 1947 when Captain Volkov arrived at the morning assembly carrying a heavy wooden crate. Inside were documents that would shatter the last illusions these German prisoners held about their nation's conduct during the war. Photographs from liberated concentration camps, testimonies from survivors, official German military reports detailing mass executions of civilians, and maps showing the systematic destruction of entire communities. Today we confront the truth, Volkov announced, his voice heavy with sorrow rather than accusation. Not to humiliate you, but because healing can only begin with honesty. Heinrich felt his world collapse as he stared at photographs from Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, and Treblinka. The images showed skeletal figures behind barbed wire, mass graves filled with bodies, and systematic murder on an industrial scale. But what devastated him most wasn't just a horror. It was recognizing some of the perpetrators in uniforms similar to his own. I had served on the Eastern Front, Heinrich whispered, his hands trembling. I had seen things, heard things, but I had convinced myself they were isolated incidents or Allied propaganda. Seeing the documentation, the scale, the systematic nature of it all, I realized I had been living in a fantasy. Klaus discovered reports from his own unit's activities in occupied Poland. Villages destroyed, civilians executed, cultural monuments deliberately obliterated. I remembered those operations, he said quietly. But we had been told we were fighting partisans, protecting German settlers, maintaining order. Now I understood we had been participating in genocide. The psychological impact was devastating. Werner suffered a complete breakdown, unable to eat or sleep for days. How could we have been so blind? He repeated endlessly. How could we have believed we were the civilized ones when we were committing such atrocities? Dr. Rosenberg became their guide through this dark night of the soul. Having survived the horrors they were now confronting, she possessed a unique authority to help them process their guilt and shame. Guilt can destroy you or transform you, she told them during individual counseling sessions. The choice is yours. The prisoners began to understand why their Soviet captors treated them with such unexpected humanity. It wasn't weakness or ignorance. It was a conscious choice to break the cycle of dehumanization that had made such horrors possible. By treating German prisoners as human beings deserving of dignity, the Soviets were demonstrating the very values that Nazi Germany had abandoned. Lieutenant Petrov lost 37 members of his extended family during the German occupation of his region, Heinrich learned. Yet he chose to see us as individuals, not as representatives of the system that had destroyed his world. His humanity made our inhumanity all the more visible. The educational sessions became confessionals where prisoners grappled with their complicity. Some, like Heinrich, had been present during war crimes but convinced themselves they were following orders. Others, like Klaus, had actively participated in operations they now understood to be criminal. A few, like Werner, had been true believers who had volunteered for the most brutal assignments. Captain Volkov introduced them to the concept of moral injury, the psychological damage that occurs when one perpetrates, witnesses, or fails to prevent acts that violate fundamental moral beliefs. You are wounded, he told them, but wounds can heal if they are properly treated. The camp's library became a sanctuary where prisoners could explore philosophical and theological questions about guilt, forgiveness, and redemption. They read Dostoevsky's Explorations of Conscience, Tolstoy's thoughts on nonviolence, and German writers like Thomas Mann who had opposed Nazism from exile. The notification came in spring 1948. Heinrich, Klaus, Werner, and dozens of other long-term prisoners would be repatriated to Germany. The news that should have brought joy instead filled them with an unexpected dread. After 3 years in Soviet captivity, they had found a strange kind of peace behind barbed wire, a peace they feared they would lose upon returning home. I remember the night before our departure, Heinrich recalled. Captain Volkov came to say goodbye, and I found myself crying. Here was a man whose country I had invaded, whose people I had helped slaughter, and I was crying because I didn't want to leave him. What did that say about the world we had created? The journey back to Germany was a reverse pilgrimage through destruction. The train passed through cities that were still rubble, countryside that remained scarred by war, and refugee camps filled with displaced persons who eyed the returning POWs with suspicion and resentment. These were not heroes coming home. They were reminders of a catastrophic defeat. Berlin, when they finally reached it, was unrecognizable. The proud capital of the Reich had become a divided city of ruins, where former neighbors now lived on opposite sides of an ideological divide. Heinrich's family apartment had been destroyed in the bombing, his parents killed in the final Soviet assault. The life he had left behind in 1945 had simply ceased to exist. Klaus found his father's bakery reduced to rubble, his mother living in a single room with 3 other refugee families. She hugged me when I returned, Klaus remembered, but I could see the shame in her eyes. Not shame in me, but shame in what we had all been part of. The whole neighborhood avoided talking about the war, as if silence could erase what had happened. The psychological adjustment was brutal. After years of meaningful work, intellectual stimulation, and genuine human connection to camp, these former prisoners found themselves in a society that was focused solely on physical survival. Food was scarce, housing was inadequate, and hope was a luxury few could afford. The Soviets had treated us like human beings with dignity and potential, Werner observed. Now we were back among our own people, and we were just mouths to feed, burdens on an already overwhelmed system. The irony was devastating. More troubling was the discovery that many Germans refused to acknowledge the full extent of their nation's crimes. In destroyed Berlin, in divided Munich, in ruined Hamburg, the prevailing attitude was that all sides had committed atrocities, that Germans had suffered too, that the past should be forgotten rather than confronted. Heinrich tried to share what he had learned in captivity, about the Holocaust, about war crimes, about the humanity of their former enemies, but found few willing listeners. My own relatives accused me of being brainwashed by communist propaganda, he said sadly. They preferred their comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The former prisoners found themselves caught between 2 worlds, the morally complex but ultimately humane environment of their captivity and the morally bankrupt but familiar environment of their homeland. Many experienced what psychologists would later term reverse culture shock. the difficulty of readjusting to one's original culture after experiencing a profoundly different way of life. Klaus struggled with survivor's guilt compounded by a new form of shame. He had been better fed, better treated, and better educated as a prisoner of war than many of his fellow Germans had been as free citizens during the final years of the Reich. How could I complain about my captivity when my captors had shown me more decency than my own government ever had? The economic miracle that would eventually transform West Germany was still years away. In 1948, the country was a wasteland of destroyed cities, traumatized populations, and collective denial. The former POWs found work where they could. Heinrich as a day laborer, Klaus helping to clear rubble, Werner repairing damaged vehicles. But their hearts remained with the community they had left behind in Camp 12. They stayed in touch with each other, meeting regularly to share their struggles with readjustment and to preserve the lessons they had learned in captivity. These informal gatherings became support groups avant la lettre, places where men who had experienced profound moral transformation could find others who understood their journey. We were like veterans of a war that no one else wanted to acknowledge, Heinrich reflected. Our real battle hadn't been against the Allies. It had been against our own prejudices, our own hatred, our own dehumanization. We had won that battle. But the victory fell hollow in a country that wasn't ready to learn from its defeat.